Hey guys, welcome to Platitube. I'm gonna narrate as I color. So while I'm actually coloring the states and the various sections, I'm gonna go ahead and give you some background. So I'll give you the education of war tactics at this time was very limited. So even West Point, premier military school, was more for engineering, and the graduates came out as second lieutenants. They did not come out as leaders of men, right? So when it comes to war, Americans are really amateurs. There are a few exceptions. We have Robert E. Lee, we have Sherman, Beauregard, and McClellan. All of them studied Napoleonic warfare, which was the premier thought of war at the time. Here's a problem for the North. All of those people are Southern. All those guys are Southern. So some of the tactics that these Southern leaders really focused on was the ideas of concentration of force. It had to be agile. It had to be adaptable. Because of that, the idea was to avoid prepared positions. So avoid earthworks, trenches, forts, whatever. The third thing to think about that they studied was the use of artillery, and that it should be used for infantry support to soften up enemy lines. Cavalry should not be used all the time. So the fourth point, cavalry should be used as a shock force only when really necessary. And ultimately, the goal was to occupy enemy territory. So these 5 things are really what Southern leaders or Southern military leaders are really going to use to try and fight the Civil War. Now, this would have been great. Unfortunately for them, some ideas are outmoded. One of the big ones is the switch to rifles. So we switch from muskets to rifles, and the difference is that rifles have a land and groove barrel that really force the bullet out at a spin, so it forces it out faster, and it gives the shooter more accuracy, far more accuracy than they would have had with a musket, which is kind of exciting for war materials, right? Not so exciting for the whole, killing people thing. Second thing that occurs that kind of makes Napoleonic warfare outmoded was the Industrial Revolution in itself and mass production. The idea of interchangeable parts, it became more cost effective to arm and supply your armies. It was more efficient, it was cheaper, so it made it just easier in general. And the third major development would be railroads. And railroads really, they change up how troops are moved from front to front. Now, remember I talked about the North having 22,000 miles of connected railroads. So what that meant is they could actually move their entire army from one side of the front to the other side of the front before the Confederacy could even react. And they got there, and their troops would have a chance to rest. They wouldn't have to walk the entire way. They wouldn't have to march the entire way. And so the Confederacy, on the other hand, would have to march from front to front, really making them really exhausting the Confederate troops compared to the fresh, rested Union troops. So there was a serious gap, right, between theory and reality. So in theory, the Napoleonic warfare was premier thought. But the reality is that it didn't really work on American soil in the Civil War. Not totally. It did sometimes. It did a few times, actually. But really, this gap can explain that, can explain why so many people died in the Civil War. Because they would try things that really didn't work. And they would keep trying them, and keep trying them, and keep trying them, and people would keep dying, and keep dying, and keep dying. So, consensus estimates for the Civil War is about 650,000 casualties. New estimates put it, as new research is being completed, puts it at 752,000. Alright, so I'm going to keep coloring and coloring and coloring. And I'm going to keep coloring and coloring. And you guys have already colored. So I'm going to go ahead and, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and make a key, so that it actually makes sense what all these colors mean. I've got red for Confederacy, green for border states. I've got this like peachy color for West Virginia because it's a state that refused to secede and split off from Virginia. And then I've got Union in blue, Union states in blue. You should be making a key as well so that you know what you're doing, like what all this stuff means. But from there, you really, at this point, I want to start talking about the start of the war. And I've talked about this in class, but just to reiterate, we have the first real skirmish of the Civil War is going to be Fort Sumter. By the way, I do want to go ahead and say I really apologize for the quality of video. It's not great, and it's kind of hard to read, so you do have to kind of listen to what I'm doing, or what I'm saying. And FYI, as I'm going along, if anything that I say is an impact or a purpose, usually I will then put it in a box somewhere connected to something. Okay, and that will make more sense as we go along. Alright, so back to Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter, it's the middle of the coast of South Carolina. It's right near Charleston, the capital of South Carolina, hotbed of rebel activity. They've always been rebellious and contrary. But Fort Sumter is a Union fort. It's on Confederate territory, and it's surrounded by the enemy. Lincoln sends a request to the Confederate government. He's trying to, play nice with them. And he's requesting to resupply Fort Sumter. It's very low on supplies. And they're too afraid to leave. They're afraid to lose the fort. And Lincoln really doesn't want to lose the fort because he does not believe that this is true war yet. He just believes it's a bit of insurrection. So basically at this point, after he sends that request, the Confederacy, the Confederate government, they full out refuse, stating that if Lincoln actually sends, if he sends any kind of supplies to Fort Sumter, the Confederacy will see it as an act of war. Now, Lincoln, again, he doesn't really see this as a war, and he sends his supplies anyway. He's like, nah, y'all are being dumb, right? So, okay, so Lincoln's notification that he was sending supplies had been made to the governor of South Carolina. He did not send it to the new Confederate government because he didn't recognize them as a government. So Pickens, a Confederate general, consults with Beauregard, another Confederate general, or commander, and Beauregard is the local Confederate commander. Soon President Davis ordered Beauregard to repeat the demand for Sumter's surrender, and if it did not, to reduce the fort before the relief expedition arrived, meaning to, knock it down. So on April 12th, Beauregard's aides take Anderson a message from Beauregard stating, and I quote, "If you will state the time which you will evacuate Fort Sumter, and agree in the meantime that you will not use your guns against us, unless ours shall be employed against Fort Sumter, we will abstain from opening fire upon you." And after consulting with his senior officers, Major Anderson replied that he would evacuate Sumter by noon on April 15th unless he received new orders from his government or additional supplies. Now, Colonel Chestnut, who was in charge, he got this reply. He considered this reply to be too conditional and wrote a reply which he handed to Anderson at 3:20 a.m. on April 12th. Or April 13th, I'm sorry. And he said, "Sir, by authority of Brigadier General Beauregard, commanding the provisional forces of the Confederate States, we have the honor to notify you that he will open fire of his batteries on Fort Sumter in 1 hour from this time. And sure enough, the Confederates started blasting the fort at 4:30 a.m. and before too long began aiming what's called heated shot, which are cannonballs that have been heated up until they're red hot and then shot out at the enemy. But they're shooting this heated shot at any wooden building in the fort, causing more damage than, say, an explosive artillery alone would do. So eventually, anything that was wooden in Fort Sumter was on fire. Now, for the most part, it was a masonry fort, meaning it was built out of stone. But for some reason, for whatever reason, they stored all their armaments and their powder in a wooden building. So they were frantically trying to get it out of there. And they began firing back as a way to prevent it. And this volley of bombardment and the survival and people like not giving up or backing down actually inspires admiration on both sides for the courage of their enemies. But by 1 p.m., the central flagpole with the American flag is fired down by cannon fire. The flag is saved and will act as a symbol later in the war, and it will also act as the inspiration for Frederick Edwin Church's Our Banner in the Sky. The Union will raise the white flag and will surrender and will be forced to retreat. Now, the impact of this battle is that it officially starts the war, and it leads to the remaining 4 states seceding. On the map, I went ahead and labeled Charleston, Fort Sumter, and added more to the key to show that I was doing this. Okay, so next I'm going to move on to First Manassas, or First Bull Run, which is the first major battle of the war. Okay, so it's 20 miles. Bull Run is 20 miles southwest of D.C. It's a rail center, so it's heavily defended by the Confederacy. Beauregard is in command of 20,000 troops. President Lincoln, he sends McDowell, and he sends him with 30,000 men. President Jefferson Davis tracks the Union movement and sends General Johnson to reinforce Beauregard at Bull Run with an additional 12,500 reinforcements. Here's the problem, is that Beauregard doesn't know any of this is happening. Beauregard doesn't detect Union movement. He also doesn't know that Davis is sending reinforcements. So he plans as if he doesn't have reinforcements, as if he's outnumbered. And the crazy thing is that both sides have the same game plan. Both of them are going to feign a frontal attack, and then in actuality, they're going to attempt to flank their opposition and attack from behind. Now, here's the problem. If everyone's doing that, nobody's actually doing that. You know what I mean? And the fact that Beauregard didn't take the time to actually keep track of Union movement provides some problems. But here's the thing. Despite this, the Confederates are losing until 2 things happen. Well, really 1 thing happens. A sergeant or a Confederate officer named Jackson stays despite being overwhelmed with Union troops. He stays and he defends a stone bridge. And seeing him stay there and defend this bridge, it really rallies the Confederate troops, and his bravery really emboldens the Confederates. And he stands there and he starts picking them off and hiding behind this bridge, behind this wall, behind this stone wall. And they end up naming him, look at that stone wall, Jackson. Because what he does is he doesn't just rally the Confederate troops, he actually slows Union troops, buying the Confederacy enough time for Johnston to arrive with their 12,500 reinforcements. So, yay, I guess, if you are pro-Confederacy. But that's where we get one of our heroes of our history, Stonewall Jackson, is from First Manassas, or First Bull Run. Now here's the impact of, so this is what I'm writing in the box right now. The impact of First Manassas, or First Bull Run was that it showed how untrained the North was. And it showed that this wouldn't be an easy fight. This wouldn't be an easy win. And the Northern troops, the Union troops, returned to really train hard. On the other side of it, it made the South very, if not overly confident of a win, so they did not press their advantage. Okay? So that's the impact of this one. And so it could have potentially been a very different war had the South actually pressed their advantage. Okay, make sure that you add however it is you're notating battles to your key. All right? I did that at the beginning of this. I may have cut that out. I don't know. Okay, so next we're going to head out west to the Western Theater of the War. The first battle on this front was Wilson's Creek. It's called the Bull Run of the West. And this was a Southern win, and it gives the Confederacy the southern half of Missouri. And it was a huge coup because the Missouri State Guard actually turned against Federal troops to help win this battle. Okay, so moving back east, we are going to have our first naval clash. To set this up, the Confederate States of America, or the CSA, had scavenged and raised a scuttled U.S. ship. Now, when I say scuttled, that means it was intentionally sunk to prevent the opposition from getting it. But the CSA went ahead and raised it anyway. This ship used to be called the USS Merrimack. Now, when the Confederacy got it, they remastered its hull with a casement of ironclad and renamed it the CSS Virginia. Now, the Confederacy is going to try and use this to break the Union blockade, which is the orange dotted line I'm drawing, around their coastline. The ship will be met at the Battle of Hampton Roads by the American ironclad, the USS Monitor. Now, so far, the blockade had been pretty effective, which is why the Confederacy attempted a break of the line. And at the Battle of Hampton Roads, it will be a naval draw, but history had been changed. The impact. This battle will become known as the Battle of the Ironclads, and it will show the validity of using ironclad warships, revolutionizing warship design. And the French, now they had ironclad ships, but until this point had been wary of using them. Now, the purpose of the coastal blockade was really step one of a larger plan. I don't know if you remember in the Mexican-American War, I talked about a guy named Winfield Scott, Old Fuss and Feathers. Well, Winfield Scott Strikes Again, and he had this plan, and he called it the Anaconda Plan. And the idea was to take all of the waterways, take the Mississippi, do not allow the Confederates to have any part of the Mississippi, and create a blockade so that the Confederacy does not have access to their coastlines, which are integral. It's like key because remember, they are a cash crop economy. They are dependent upon exporting their goods because they don't have any manufacturing to make goods themselves. They're dependent upon trade. So when you cut off their coast and then you cut off the Mississippi, what it does is it cuts them off from trade. It also cuts the Confederacy in half. It cuts them off from supplies from one side to the other. Because, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Texas has a lot of beef. It also had access to Mexico. And basically, the Anaconda Plan was to create a stranglehold on the South and their supply lines. So much like an anaconda does when consuming its prey. So, yes. So this is the Anaconda Plan. That's what I'm actually writing in that box in the Gulf right now. Make sure that you, in the other box, the one by Hampton Roads, I talked about warship design and how it revolutionized the Battle of the Ironclads. Okay, so At this point, I've added something in my key for the Union blockade, and I'm about to add something to notate what rivers look like when you see them. Because we're about to enter some place that is key to the Mississippi tributary, to the river system. But just to be very clear, the winter of 1861 and early 1862, the tide will really turn in the Union direction. And we're going to move our way into the interior of the Confederacy. And we're going to look at Fort Henry in Tennessee and Fort Donelson in Kentucky. Now, apparently Lincoln is reported to have said that these rivers, the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers, were key to really gaining some real leverage into the South, because it was the best way to get into the interior of the South without really having to fight too bad. Now, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, these are Confederate forts protecting the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. Ulysses S. Grant, this is where he starts to really make his name. He's going to show up with 27,000 troops on land, with the Union Navy on the river, and they're going to go against 21,000 Confederate troops. Fort Henry surrenders without a fight. They basically just hold up their hands. They're like, nah, I'm good. And then they retreat to Fort Donelson. Now, Donelson is weakened, and their top-ranking leaders actually escape or desert. Remember, there's a high level of desertion, leaving the Confederate men alone, leaving them alone. And General Buckner is the only one left, and he asked Grant. So Grant and Buckner were actually friends. Buckner asked Grant, a longtime friend, for surrender terms, and Grant replies that he had no terms except immediate and unconditional surrender. Now, here's the thing about that phrase. That is a phrase we will use again and again throughout American history when it comes to war. We will use it in World War II, and it will lead to the dropping of atomic bombs. We will use it in Vietnam, and because of that tactic, we will have some of the heaviest American losses in U.S. history. And it works about the same here. Well, it doesn't work the same here. The reason why they keep using it is because it scared Buckner so much that he was like, oh my goodness, okay, sure, done. Ultimate surrender. And, the men were taken as POWs and whatnot. So here's the impact of Fort Henry and Donelson. It opened up not one, but 2 points of invasion. 2 points of invasion for the Confederates. Into the Confederacy. And it really cuts off, it isolates the Confederates that are in Kentucky and Tennessee. Now, this is problematic because they are so close to the border. They really needed the support of the Deep South. And when they get cut off, it's only a matter of time. So, just to let you know what I'm doing on the map, I put 2. Okay, so next we have the Battle of Shiloh. This is the first really big battle of the war. They fight all day. Beauregard and Johnston are winning. These are the Confederate generals until nightfall. And then Beauregard and Johnston are like, okay, we're gonna go ahead and withdraw. And this allows the Union time to recoup, and it allows Wallace to join Grant, to join their Union with reinforcements. So this is problematic. I'm also labeling New Orleans, but Shiloh, just to be clear, Shiloh was a Union win, huge Union win. Next, we're going to have the Battle of New Orleans. This is another Northern victory. It basically, by taking New Orleans, it stops all shipments from this part of the South. And Confederates lose a major port, restricting their access to the Mississippi River. And this is huge, guys. So you have to think about how important these two losses were for the Confederacy, and how really great they were for the Union. Okay, so now we're going to the other side of the map, and the first thing that I am going to start drawing is what is the Peninsular Campaign. So the line I'm drawing is McClellan's Peninsular Campaign. So McClellan is the Union, and he's highly paranoid, so he moves super slowly up the Potomac. And we have a new commander of the Army of North Virginia, and that's going to be Robert E. Lee. Maybe you've heard of him. And Lee swiftly moves in and beats McClellan down. So this is a huge Confederate win, right? And so major impact is going to be that it's going to boost the South's morale, especially after a really hard year of 1862. So what I'm writing right here is that it's boosting the South's morale. Finally, you know, they're getting something good. At this point, we are following Robert E. Lee's successful push north to a point, right? So now he's just won against McClellan in the Peninsular Campaign. And next, he heads to Bull Run again. He heads to Manassas, and this is going to be second Manassas or second Bull Run. And basically the Union Army is now under Pope, and the Confederate Army is under Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. And the Confederates were outnumbered 75,000 to 55,000. And Lee takes a risk. He took a risk by dividing his forces to flank and surround. So what he does is, what's happening is the Confederate forces under Jackson, they make a wide flanking maneuver, and they cut off the communication line, causing panic between the Army and D.C. Now, this plan depended upon mediocre leadership. Now, the Union forces, they saw Jackson move. They saw him make that maneuver, but they assumed he was retreating. And they saw Longstreet, who was another Confederate officer, but again, they assumed he was retreating. So they really were mediocre leadership, and they did not push their position. And they could have decimated Jackson and Longstreet, but they did not concentrate their troops or coordinate their piecemeal attacks. So it's going to lead to a Confederate win. So at the same time as all of this is happening, Lee gets really bolstered, and the impact of Second Manassas is that it's going to embolden the South. It's going to embolden Lee to really make that push to into the North, to go on the offensive. Now, here's the problem, is that one of the key advantages that the South had is that they were fighting a defensive war. But once Lee makes that push into Union territory, he runs the risk of having to actually take enemy territory, which is much harder to do. So he pushes his way up to Antietam, and Lee moves north into Maryland on the other side of the Potomac. Now, he expected Marylanders to join the Confederate state, the CSA's cause, when they saw the triumphant Confederate army. But Marylanders' ardor was repressed by the reality of the bedraggled Confederate army, because they were starving, they were ragtag, their uniforms didn't match. It wasn't like this triumphant march through Maryland. It was more like an exhausted, like, holy crap, do we really have to do this kind of march? Because the Union victories out west were really beginning to take their toll on the Confederate supply lines. Remember, they've cut them off at this point. All right, so the other thing is Lee had his battle plans written on paper, and then he wrapped them in cigars, and he gave his cigars to his aide. And his aide lost The cigars. The cigars were picked up by the Union, and the plans were found. So the North knew, the Union knew what Lee's battle plans were. And the whole purpose of Antietam was really to allow the South to win foreign recognition, which would then lead to foreign monetary aid, but also attempt to take the railroad, because remember, railroads are super important. Okay? Now, the result of Antietam, it's not going to be a win or a loss, which is why I'm coloring it both colors on the map. The result of Antietam is that it is a stalemate, and Antietam was the bloodiest day of the war. The South did not receive foreign aid, and here's the crazy part. Up until that point, Great Britain was just about to sign the check, and as soon as the South lost in Antietam, they kind of, hung back a bit. Now, this is going to force Lee to retreat back out of the North and back into safe territory into Virginia again. Now, when Antietam occurs, what's going to happen is Lincoln is going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation is just a speech. It's just something that a president says. Now, it can be taken into consideration to create legislation around it, but let's actually talk about what the Emancipation Proclamation is. Okay? While I'm writing all of the impacts and significances and purposes and results on the map, like, you write whatever you think is important about what I'm talking about here. But the Emancipation Proclamation, basically he states, look, here's a deal, South. At this point, your choices are to surrender and free all of your slaves. In fact, what he says is all slaves in any territories in rebellion are free. That's what he says. But note, he said states or territories in rebellion. It says nothing about the slaves that are in the states that are still in the Union. So places like Missouri and Kentucky and West Virginia. All of those places, it says nothing about that. The crazy thing about the Emancipation Proclamation is it was actually written a year before Antietam, before the Battle of Antietam, and it was shelved because Lincoln was really waiting for an opportune time or a decisive battle to issue this proclamation. And he felt that Antietam was it. He felt like that was the time. And it didn't work. Not the way he wanted it to, anyway. The Confederate States did not come running back with open arms, that's for sure. And now it's the end of 1862, beginning of 1863, and we meet our major players again at Fredericksburg. Now, in Fredericksburg, we're back on home territory, so again, the Confederates are winning. So go ahead and color that star red or pink or whatever it is you want to color, and then put a black arrow to Chancellorsville. It's right around the corner. Chancellorsville, it's another Confederate win. So these two minor wins in Virginia, they give Lee the confidence to go north again. And the reason why this is important is because the purpose of going north into Union territory is the same as it was before, except the stakes are higher because Great Britain is now requiring a Confederate victory on Union soil to prove the likelihood of staying separate. Basically, if Lee pushes into Union territory and loses again, they won't stand a chance. So this time he decides to head up into Pennsylvania, and he heads to Gettysburg. After his success at Chancellorsville in Virginia in May of 1863, Lee led his army through the Shenandoah Valley to begin his second invasion of the North, the Gettysburg Campaign. Now, his army is in high spirits, and Lee intended to shift the focus of the summer campaign from the war-ravaged northern Virginia and hoped to influence northern politicians to give up their prosecution of the war by penetrating as far as Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or even Philadelphia. However, President Abraham Lincoln basically told his Major General Joseph Hooker to move his army in pursuit. But Hooker was relieved of command just 3 days before the battle and replaced by Major General Meade. Now, elements of the two armies initially collided at Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863, as Lee urgently concentrated his forces there, with his objective being to engage the Union Army and decimate it. Now, low ridges to the northwest of town were defended initially by Union Cavalry Division and soon reinforced with 2 corps of Union infantry. However, 2 large Confederate corps assaulted them from the northwest and north, collapsing the hastily developed Union line. So the Confederates are actually kind of winning at this point, and everything's going really well, but this is just day 1. On the second day of battle, most of both armies had assembled, and the Union line was laid out in a defensive formation resembling a fishhook. Now, in the late afternoon of July 2nd, Lee launches a heavy assault on the Union left flank. On the Union right, Confederates will assault, go into full-on assault at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. And all across the battle, all across it, this fishhook, it's actually holding, and Union defenders hold their lines. So huge losses on day 2, but a stalemate. Nobody's really making any headway. It's just kind of, going nowhere. Now the third day is going to be the end for the South, because General Pickett decides that he is going to take 12,500 Confederate soldiers and just charge at the center of the Union line. Like he's playing a game of Red Rover, let Pickett come over. It's the craziest thing. And of course he is repulsed by Union fire, and the Confederate Army takes huge losses. Now, the result of this war is that it's the turning point of the entire Civil War. Gettysburg is the turning point. Now, here's why. Because the South lost. Great Britain flat out refuses to provide any aid to the Confederate Army, to the Confederacy at all. And without that foreign aid, they have no chance, because their losses are so great, and they are so low on supplies, and they are so bedraggled and starving and hungry that really the Confederacy will never have the strength to launch another major offensive. And it's after Gettysburg that Lincoln issues the Gettysburg Address. And this is going to be a morale booster for the Union. And it's also really going to alter the message, the cause, the purpose. Now, it's not just about maintaining the Union. Now, it's about taking care of the people of the United States, all the people. Now it becomes about emancipation for real. Now it becomes about taking care of each other. And so it becomes a moral cause, not a political cause, not an economic cause, a moral imperative that the Union come back together. Moving back out to the west, so you're going to have to go back to the larger United States map, flip your paper over. At the same time as Gettysburg, we have the Battle of Vicksburg, and this is like the great battle out west. And essentially, in May and June of 1863, Ulysses S. Grant and his armies converge on Vicksburg, and they basically trap the Confederate army, who is being led by Pemberton at this point. And Vicksburg surrenders after a year-long siege. No, that's Petersburg. Sorry, Vicksburg, there was a siege. It wasn't a year long, but it was a fairly long siege. And siege, this is something that the Confederates couldn't afford. Sieges are not something they could afford. They did not have the supplies for this, didn't have the ammunition. And so the Battle of Vicksburg was going to be arguably the culmination of one of the most brilliant military campaigns of the war. So with the loss of Vicksburg, this Union victory will give the Union control of the Mississippi River, effectively cutting off the Confederacy from Texas, which had the major access to Mexico and supplies and resources and food. And so this is Scott's Anaconda Plan realized. The Confederacy is cut in half. So it also, and here's the other big thing, is that Grant's success in this Western campaign boosted his reputation, leading to his ultimate appointment as General-in-Chief of the Union armies, in which he will face off with Robert E. Lee. Okay, so after Ulysses S. Grant is made chief commander of the Union forces, and he heads off to North Virginia to meet Robert E. Lee, the Battle of the Great Generals, it occurs between 1864 and 1865. It's basically the time period in which Grant chases Lee through Virginia. And it all starts at the Battle of Wilderness. At the Battle of Wilderness, Grant wins. He basically sets the formula for every major meetup throughout this race. Grant wins, Lee runs, he retreats, Grant follows him. Okay? Then they hit Spotsylvania. Grant wins, Lee runs, Grant follows. Then they hit Cold Harbor. Grant wins, Lee runs, Grant follows. And finally, one more time, they hit Petersburg. And in Petersburg, Grant wins. Lee doesn't run. Grant sieges. So in Petersburg, they settle in for a year-long siege. And they're just hanging out there. And basically what this does is it decimates the Confederacy's resources, their supplies. Like, they don't have anything left after this. It pretty much takes everything out of them. All their ammunition, all their food, clothing, water, you name it. People are trying to desert, but they can't get past the Union lines. I think at this point people would rather be, and I'm just guessing here, but I would think that I would rather be a POW for the Union than I would be an actual member of the Confederate Army. Just seems, it was a really rough time for the Confederacy. So they settle in for their year-long surge. Now, maybe you haven't noticed, but if you look at Grant's line, how this is actually working, it's this like dance around Grant's ultimate goal, which is to take the capital of Richmond. Now, the capital, Richmond, is the Confederates' capital city, right? But despite multiple efforts, no, it's a stalemate in I almost said Richardson, in Richmond. And so no, like, technically the Confederates still hold it, but they're taking a huge beating to try and maintain Richmond against Grant's assault and against the Union assault. Okay, guys, at the same time as Grant's chase of Lee through Virginia, we have to talk a little bit about a Union officer named Sherman, who was in Georgia. Now, when you think about the Civil War and you think about Major General William Sherman, it's very immediately it conjures up, it should, from this point forward, conjure up visions of fire and smoke, destruction, desolation. So all the worst parts of the Civil War, a lot of that, like the worst parts of Gone with the Wind, you need to think about Sherman's march to the sea. So what he does is he wins in Atlanta. He wins a decisive battle in Atlanta. And then he marches his troops from Atlanta to Savannah. And along the way, he basically, it's this total war tactics against a civilian population. Like death and destruction and rape and pillage and murder and you know, it's this awful image of these horrible people leaving a trail. Like, according from the Confederate side, it was blue-clad soldiers marching with impunity and their scavenged booty dragging behind them, leaving a trail of crying women and sobbing babies. And basically, Sherman is remembered, for the most part in history, as a very hard, cruel man. He was unfeeling. He was a brute, and he used brute force to end the war quickly. Now, there are some people who will argue that no, this march, it wasn't, an off-the-cuff reaction. He wasn't just being vindictive. He wasn't just being cruel. What he was trying to do, this is according to revisionist history, right? He was trying to use this idea of destructive war to convince Confederates that the war was over and that they needed to give up and that they needed to come back to the Union. And he wanted to end the war as quickly as possible. And he felt like that was the way to do it. Now, whether or not you believe that he was a monster or you believe that he was a person trying to end the war, either way, we're talking about a very long trek, a long march that destroyed a huge portion of Georgia and leaves an irrevocable mark on the psyche of Southern people, especially in Georgia. But I will say this, it does actually achieve, it does demoralize the South so much that they're done. They're ready to just not fight anymore. And Grant and Lee meet up again at the Battle of Appomattox, or Appomattox Courthouse. And so, basically, he's constantly, like, Lee is constantly barraged by Union troops, by federal troops, and he's continually cut off from turning south. So instead, Lee heads west, and he eventually arrives at Appomattox on April 8th. Now he heads for the South Side Railroad at Appomattox Station, where food supplies are supposed to be waiting, that the Confederates were cut off. But the Confederates were cut off again. They were surrounded by Union troops, and despite trying to escape, Lee's army at this point was trapped. So, basically, approximately 9,000 men under Gordon and Fitzhugh Lee are deployed into the fields west of the village before dawn, and they waited. And the attack, it launched at 8 a.m., and the Union infantry, like, they just kept coming. And finally, Ulysses S. Grant, he cuts off and destroys Lee's army. Bowing to the inevitable, Lee will order his troops to retreat through the village. Here's the thing. Now, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant actually communicated by letter towards the end of the war. And they actually... Lee had already started negotiating. He had started negotiating terms of surrender. And so Lee, at this point, he basically makes the decision, rather than destroy his army and sacrifice the lives of his soldiers for no reason, because they've lost, they have lost, he decides to unofficially surrender. And basically, he goes to Lee, he's like, look, you know, here's all I really ask. Allow my men to return home unmolested. Please give them some food. They haven't had a decent meal in months. Some of them years. They're starving. Allow the officers to retain their horses to keep, because as Southerners, they need those horses. And, you know, although it wasn't the end of the war, the surrender of Lee's army of Northern Virginia really set the stage for its conclusion. And through the lenient terms, Confederate troops were paroled and allowed to return to their homes. And really, these measures served as a blueprint. It served as a way for the rest of the surrender of the remaining Confederate forces, how that was going to work. And, yeah, it was the beginning of the end. And it was the start and the beginning of the reunification of the United States. And that is the battles.